He did this, and his life changed forever. He was always just an ordinary carpenter's apprentice on Western film sets. His days passed by quietly, learning the craft from old Tomás Delgado. Nothing hinted at trouble. But one day, something happened that turned everything upside down. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Just a young Clint Eastwood, watching Tomás work between takes, absorbing every detail of how the master craftsman built movie magic from raw lumber. But then, things started to get even stranger. Seconds felt like an eternity. His heart was pounding. And then, at that very moment when it seemed like there was no turning back, Tomás handed him a worn carpenter's hammer and said, "Today, muchacho, you learn that building character is just like building sets, one careful measurement at a time." But the most unbelievable part happened after that. It was so incredible that if someone had told him before, he never would have believed it. That 60 years later he would stand on those same weathered boards, a Hollywood legend himself, fighting to preserve not just the physical sets, but the legacy of the quiet craftsman who had taught him that true artistry flourishes in the spaces between spotlights. Now at 94, Clint Eastwood returns to face his past and protect the foundation of his success from those who would tear it down for profit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching California sun beats down on Studio Lot 23, where 94-year-old Clint Eastwood stands amid the smoldering remnants of what was once Hollywood's most iconic Western film set. The weathered wooden facades, each board holding decades of cinematic history, crackle under the heat of small fires dotting the landscape. In his weathered hands, he clutches a worn carpenter's hammer, not his, but one belonging to a man who shaped not just sets, but souls in this very place. 60 years ago, Rick Solomon, now a silver-haired entertainment mogul, faces Eastwood across the burning lot, his designer suit incongruous with the dusty surroundings. "Times change, Clint," he calls out, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man who spent decades selling nostalgia. "Nobody wants authentic anymore. They want experiences, attractions, something they can touch." The irony of his words isn't lost on Clint, who remembers when Rick was just a child actor, wide-eyed and genuine, before Hollywood transformed him into something else entirely. Maria Delgado watches from the sidelines, her historian's heart breaking at the sight of history literally going up in flames. She sees beyond the celebrity standing before her, finally understanding why her grandfather, Tomás, spoke of this man with such quiet pride. The old carpenter's hammer in Clint's grip was her grandfather's most prized possession, a symbol of craftsmanship and integrity in an industry that increasingly values neither. The confrontation draws curious onlookers, crew members, security, personnel, and even a few paparazzi who somehow caught wind of the drama unfolding. Their presence amplifies the tension, each person representing a different era of Hollywood's evolution. Some recognize the historical significance of the moment, while others simply see potential viral content for their social media feeds. Memories flood Clint's mind, taking him back to 1954 when he first stepped onto this very lot. He was nobody then, just another ambitious young actor, until Tomás Delgado took him under his wing. The old carpenter taught him more than just the craft of filmmaking. He instilled values that would guide Clint's entire career. "A set isn't just wood and nails, muchacho," Tomás would say, his calloused hands smoothing rough-hewn timber. "It's a canvas where dreams come alive." Rick's development plans spread across a nearby table, whipping in the hot wind, glossy renderings of Western World Adventure Park, promising thrill rides and virtual reality experiences. The contrast between these artificial visions and the authentic craftsmanship surrounding them couldn't be starker. "Progress is inevitable," Rick announces, his voice carrying the rehearsed confidence of countless boardroom presentations. "You of all people should understand adaptation, Clint. Wasn't that what made you a legend?" But Clint's thoughts drift to the countless films shot here, the careers launched, the stories told. He remembers Tomás working late into the night, perfecting every detail, teaching young actors about respect for the craft. The old carpenter never sought recognition, content in knowing he contributed to something greater than himself. Now, his granddaughter Maria stands witness to what could be the final chapter of his legacy. The situation reaches a boiling point as bulldozers idle at the lot's entrance, their diesel engines growling like hungry predators. Rick's security team shifts nervously, unsure how to handle this standoff between two Hollywood titans. The younger guards look to their older colleagues who remember when Clint Eastwood's word carried more weight than any contract. Maria steps forward, her professional demeanor as a history teacher momentarily giving way to raw emotion. She's spent years documenting Hollywood's golden age, but nothing in her research captured the real human cost of progress. The stories her grandfather told her about this place, about the young actor who listened and learned, suddenly take on new meaning as she watches Clint stand his ground. The hammer in Clint's grip represents more than just a tool. It's a symbol of craftsmanship, authenticity, and a time when Hollywood built things to last. As he faces down Rick Solomon and his vision of the future, the question hangs in the air. Can the soul of cinema survive in an age of artificial experiences? And, more importantly, what happens when the last guardians of that authentic spirit take their final stand? The desert wind whispered through the abandoned western set as Clint Eastwood's SUV kicked up dust along the forgotten access road. At 94, he hadn't planned on returning to this particular piece of his past. But Rick Solomon's development plans had forced his hand. The steering wheel felt familiar beneath his weathered fingers, though his joints protested every bump and dip in the unpaved path. 3 weeks before everything would go up in flames, Clint found himself drawn back to where it all began. The old western set stood like a skeletal reminder of Hollywood's golden age, its weathered facades telling stories that most had forgotten. Who would have thought that a cocky young actor's first real lessons about life would come from a Mexican carpenter named Tomás Delgado? The memories surfaced unbidden as Clint parked beside what remained of the old saloon. 40 years ago, Tomás had shown him how to read the grain of wood, how to understand that every piece had its own story. Like people, the old carpenter would say, wood doesn't bend unless it wants to. Those words had shaped more than just Clint's understanding of carpentry. A figure emerged from behind the saloon's crooked doors, and for a moment, Clint's heart jumped, but it wasn't Tomás. Maria Delgado, clipboard in hand and determination in her stride, approached his vehicle with the same protective intensity her grandfather once showed toward these buildings. Her role as the local history teacher had made her the unofficial guardian of this place, though she clearly hadn't expected company today. "This is private property," Maria called out before recognition flickered across her face. The tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Mr. Eastwood, I didn't realize you still remembered this place existed." The words carried an edge that cut deeper than she probably intended. How could he explain that he'd stayed away not out of neglect, but out of respect for Tomás's wishes? The old carpenter had never wanted recognition, had refused interviews, had chosen to let his work speak for itself. But now, with Rick Solomon's entertainment complex threatening to erase it all, silence no longer felt like an option. "Your grandfather taught me more than just how to handle a hammer," Clint said, carefully extracting himself from the vehicle. "Where is he these days?" Maria's expression softened slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "He's in assisted, living now. Still talks about this place. Still talks about you, actually, though not always kindly." The admission drew a rough chuckle from Clint. Of course, Tomás would have choice words about him. Their last conversation had been complicated. The memory of Rick Solomon's first attempt to commercialize the set decades ago still left a bitter taste. Young Clint had stood by, uncertain and conflicted, while Tomás fought to preserve the authenticity of their work. "Rick Solomon's back," Clint stated, watching Maria's reaction carefully. "And this time he's got investors." "We know." Maria's fingers tightened around her clipboard. "He's been sending representatives, making offers. Grandfather won't sell his stake, but some of the other original crew members." She trailed off, the implications clear. The sun beat down mercilessly as they stood there, 2 generations removed from the golden age they were trying to preserve. Around them, The set held its secrets. The hidden marks Tomás had carved into support beams, the precisely measured angles that had made this fake town feel real on camera. How many viewers had noticed that level of craftsmanship? How many had understood that these weren't just buildings but a master carpenter's legacy? Your grandfather once told me that everything we build becomes part of who we are, Clint said, his voice carrying across the empty street. I didn't understand what he meant back then. Thought he was just talking about the buildings. Maria studied him with new interest, perhaps seeing beyond the Hollywood icon to the young man her grandfather had once mentored. And now? Now I know he was talking about something bigger, something Rick Solomon never understood. Clint gestured to the buildings around them. This place isn't just wood and nails. It's about the people who built it, who believed in doing things right, even when no one was looking. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their conversation. A cloud of dust on the horizon signaled unwelcome company, probably more of Solomon's people. Maria's posture stiffened again, protective instincts taking over. They're early, she muttered, checking her watch. The meeting wasn't supposed to be until... Clint's eyes narrowed as he recognized the distinctive silhouette of Rick Solomon's luxury car. Some ghosts, it seemed, refused to stay buried in the past. The question now was whether those ghosts would help preserve this place or hasten its destruction. The scent of sawdust and aged wood stirred memories Clint Eastwood had buried decades ago. Standing in the doorway of the weathered workshop, his weathered hand traced the familiar grain of the doorframe. The same doorframe where he'd once leaned as a young actor, watching Tomás Delgado transform raw lumber into movie magic. But would the old carpenter even remember those days? Through the dust-filtered sunlight, Clint spotted the hunched figure of Tomás at his workbench, hands still steady despite his advanced age as they guided a plane across a length of pine. The rhythmic scraping sound transported Clint back to 1955, when these same walls had echoed with the bustle of crew members preparing for another day of shooting. How many hours had he spent here, seeking refuge from the pressures of his early career? The sound of footsteps behind him drew Clint from his reverie. Maria Delgado's voice carried a sharp edge as she approached. "Mr. Eastwood, this is private property." Her protective instinct toward her grandfather was evident in every word, every gesture. But before Clint could respond, Tomás looked up from his work, his aged eyes crinkling with recognition. "El joven actor," Tomás said softly, setting down his tools. "Though not so young anymore, eh?" His Spanish accent had softened over the years, but the warmth in his voice remained unchanged. The old carpenter's recognition sparked something in Clint, relief perhaps, or validation of memories he'd sometimes questioned. Rick Solomon's voice cut through the moment like a discordant note. "Well, isn't this touching?" The former child, actor turned producer, leaned against the workshop's entrance, his presence an unwelcome reminder of the commercial world Clint had tried to leave behind. Two old-timers reminiscing about the good old days. This could make quite a headline. Maria stepped between Rick and her grandfather, her historian's instinct for preservation evident in her stance. "This isn't one of your nostalgia conventions, Mr. Solomon. These are people's lives, not promotional opportunities." Her words carried the weight of years spent protecting her grandfather's privacy from those who would exploit it. Tomás rose slowly from his workbench, his movements deliberate, but purposeful. He reached for a wooden box on a high shelf, his hands finding it without hesitation despite the workshop's dim light. "Clint, do you remember this?" Inside lay a collection of small wooden figures, miniature set pieces and character studies Tomás had carved during production breaks. The sight of these forgotten artifacts triggered a flood of memories. Young Clint watching Tomás work, learning about patience and craftsmanship between takes, understanding that every role, whether carpenter or actor, carried its own dignity. These lessons had shaped his career far more than any acting coach's instructions. Rick's presence continued to cast a shadow over the reunion. His successful career trading on Hollywood nostalgia represented everything Clint had rejected: the commodification of memories, the reduction of craft to spectacle. Yet here was Tomás, still practicing his art without concern for recognition or reward. Maria observed the interaction between her grandfather and Clint with growing curiosity. The antagonism she'd initially shown toward the actor began to soften as she witnessed their genuine connection. How many stories had her grandfather never shared about his years working behind the scenes of Hollywood's golden age? The workshop held more than just tools and memories. It contained the invisible threads that connected these lives across decades. Tomás's quiet dedication to his craft had influenced not just the physical structures of countless Western sets, but the character of those who worked alongside him. His mentorship of young Clint stood in stark contrast to the path Rick had chosen, one valuing authenticity over acclaim. As afternoon light filtered through the workshop's dusty windows, the present and past seemed to merge. The young actor, who had sought guidance in this space, now stood as a living bridge between eras, while Tomás continued his work as if time had never passed. What other secrets did these wooden walls hold? What lessons remained to be learned from the carpenter's shadow? The scent of sawdust and varnish transported Clint back to 1954, when Hollywood still held its mysteries, and every day brought new lessons from unexpected teachers. At 94, his memories remained sharp as desert air, particularly those of Tomás Delgado's workshop, where he'd spent countless hours between takes, learning far more than just the art of woodworking. Young Clint had found himself drawn to the quiet sanctuary of Tomás's domain, a place where the carpenter's weathered hands shaped raw lumber into precise set pieces. While other actors retreated to their trailers, Clint would linger, watching. Tomás transformed rough-hewn boards into intricate props that would never receive screen credit. The old carpenter's methodical approach fascinated him. How could such patience exist in an industry built on rushing from one shot to the next? Wood has memory, Tomás had told him one afternoon, guiding Clint's inexperienced hands along the grain of a pine board. Like people, it holds its history in every ring, every knot. Treat it with respect, and it will tell you its story. These words echoed now across decades as Clint stood in the present-day workshop, surrounded by tools that seemed frozen in time. Rick Solomon had never understood this connection. Even as a child actor, he'd dismissed the crew as mere servants to his rising star. But Clint had recognized something profound in Tomás's craft, a dedication to excellence that transcended fame or recognition. While Rick chased autographs and magazine covers, Clint spent his breaks learning the value of patience, precision, and humility. The lessons went beyond mere carpentry. Tomás taught him to read a script like he read wood grain, looking for the hidden structures that held everything together. A story, like a piece of furniture, must be built on a solid foundation, he'd explain, while demonstrating how to cut a perfect joint. Without proper support, everything falls apart. Maria's voice, so similar to her grandfather's in its quiet authority, pulled Clint from his reverie. She'd found him lost in thought, running his fingers along an ancient workbench, scarred by decades of creation. Did she know how many hours he'd spent at this very spot, absorbing wisdom that shaped not just his craft but his character? Those early days held a different kind of magic than the glitter of premieres and award shows. In Tomás's workshop, young Clint discovered that true artistry often hid in the shadows, in the careful attention to details others might never notice. The old carpenter's hand, strong yet gentle, guided him through more than just woodworking techniques. They showed him a path to authenticity in an industry built on illusion. The relationship between mentor and student had evolved naturally, without the formal arrangements or publicity that typically accompanied Hollywood partnerships. Tomás never sought credit for his influence on the young actor's career, content instead to share his knowledge freely with anyone who showed genuine interest. His grandson would later reveal that Tomás had recognized something in young Clint, a hunger for substance over style, for craftsmanship over quick fame. Looking back now, Clint understood how those quiet afternoons had shaped his approach to directing. The patience learned while watching Tomás select the perfect piece of wood translated into careful casting choices. The precision required for dovetail joints became the meticulous attention to detail in scene composition. Even his reputation for efficient, focused film sets could be traced back to the carpenter's workshop, where every movement served a purpose and waste was never tolerated. But beyond the practical skills, Tomás had offered something more valuable, a model of dignity and craft that stood in stark contrast to Hollywood's obsession with celebrity. While Rick Solomon chased fame through increasingly desperate attempts to relive his child star days, Clint had built a career on the foundation of those workshop lessons. Would today's young actors understand the value of such quiet mentorship? How many would trade their trailers for a chance to learn at the feet of a master craftsman? The memories stirred questions that had haunted Clint for decades. Had he ever properly thanked Tomás for those formative lessons? Did the old carpenter know how deeply his wisdom had penetrated? As Maria watched him from across the workshop, perhaps seeing shadows of her grandfather's influence, Clint wondered if it was finally time to acknowledge the debt he owed to the man who had taught him that true artistry flourishes in the spaces between spotlights. In the quiet corners of memory, where truth and legend intertwine, lies a story about a simple garment that would become an icon of American cinema. Who could have known that a weathered piece of cloth, passed from weathered hands to young ones, would help shape the identity of one of Hollywood's most enduring figures? Clint Eastwood's fingers traced the familiar weave of the poncho now draped across his lap, each thread a testament to decades of wear and meaning. The garment had survived countless shoots, withstood the harsh desert sun, and somehow managed to outlast many of its contemporaries. But its true value lay not in its durability or its fame, but in the moment it changed hands nearly 60 years ago. The memory surfaced with surprising clarity. A young Clint, barely into his 20s, helping Tomás Delgado pack away equipment after a particularly challenging day on set. The air had grown cool as evening approached, and Tomás had noticed his young protege shivering slightly in the desert wind. Without ceremony or fanfare, the older man had reached into his personal belongings and pulled out the poncho, a family heirloom that had traveled with him from Mexico decades earlier. "My father wore this when he worked the railroads," Tomás had explained, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "He gave it to me when I crossed the border, saying it would protect me from more than just the cold." The carpenter's calloused hands had extended the folded garment toward Clint, who had instinctively stepped back, understanding the significance of what was being offered. Rick Solomon, then just another child actor on set, had witnessed the exchange from afar, his young face betraying a mixture of curiosity and envy. Even then, there had been something in Rick's eyes that suggested he understood the meaning of such moments, the passing down of not just objects, but of trust and responsibility. Maria Delgado's voice cut through Clint's reverie, bringing him back to the present. "Abuelo never told me about giving you the poncho," she said, her tone softer than it had been in their previous encounters. "He kept a photograph, though, you wearing it for the first time. It's still in his workshop." The mention of Tomás's workshop stirred another layer of memory. The day after receiving the poncho, Clint had arrived early to help Tomás with his morning routine of checking and maintaining the set pieces. The older man had shown him how to wear the garment properly, demonstrating the various ways it could be draped to protect against sun, wind, or cold. But more importantly, he had shared stories of its history, tales of his father's work on the railroads, of border crossings under starlit skies, of the dignity found in hard work and quiet determination. What had started as a simple gift had become a symbol of something far more profound. The poncho represented a bridge between cultures, between generations, between the world of craft and creativity. It carried with it lessons about humility, about the value of manual labor, about the importance of remembering where one came from, lessons that would shape Clint's approach to his craft throughout his career. Rick Solomon had never understood this aspect of their shared past. To him, the poncho had become merely another piece of movie memorabilia, something to be auctioned off to the highest bidder at one of his nostalgia conventions. But how could you put a price on something that carried the weight of such history? The garment had appeared in multiple films over the years, becoming as much a part of Clint's on-screen persona as his squinted eyes and measured drawl. Yet few knew its true origin story. how it had passed from the hands of a railroad worker to his son, from a carpenter to a young actor, carrying with it a legacy of craftsmanship and dignity that transcended the glamour of Hollywood. Maria's eyes now rested on the poncho with newfound understanding. Perhaps she too was beginning to see beyond its surface value, to recognize it as a thread connecting her grandfather's world to the larger tapestry of cinema history. But what other stories lay hidden in its worn fabric? What other lessons had Tomás woven into its gift? The poncho represented more than just a costume piece or a lucky charm. It was a physical reminder of the mentorship that had helped shape a young actor's path. But as Clint sat there, holding this piece of his past, questions began to surface about the future. What would become of such meaningful artifacts in an industry increasingly driven by digital effects and virtual realities? How could the next generation understand the value of such tangible connections to history? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Maria Delgado's classroom as she methodically packed away student papers into her worn leather satchel. Teaching local history had always been more than just a job. It was her way of preserving the stories that shaped their community. But today, one particular story demanded her attention, and it wasn't found in any textbook. News of Clint Eastwood's return to town had spread quickly, stirring up memories that had lain dormant for decades. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she touched the old photograph on her desk, her grandfather Tomás standing proudly among the film crew, his carpenter's tools at his feet. How many times had she asked him about his work on those early westerns, only to receive that gentle, knowing smile and a change of subject? The sound of footsteps in the empty hallway drew her attention. Rick Solomon's latest promotional materials for his nostalgia convention had plastered the town with images of a young Clint Eastwood, each one a reminder of what Maria considered a betrayal. Why had the famous actor waited until now, when her grandfather's health was failing, to finally return? Maria found Eastwood exactly where she expected, outside her grandfather's workshop, his weathered hand resting on the old wooden door. Georg, 94. He moved more slowly than the gunslinger of legend, but his eyes retained that same penetrating intensity she remembered from his films. What right did he have to stand there, touching the place that held so many of her family's memories? Mr. Eastwood, she called out, her voice carrying the weight of decades of questions. I've been wondering when you'd show up. The actor turned, studying her with a mix of recognition and uncertainty. Did he see Tomás in her features? Could he read the years of protective love she held for her grandfather? The man who had helped shape Eastwood's career had never sought recognition, but his granddaughter had watched him watch every new Eastwood film, noting the quiet pride that would flash across his face at certain moments. You must be Maria, Eastwood said, his voice gravelly with age. You look just like your grandmother in that picture Tomás kept in his workshop. The personal observation caught her off guard. How many details of her family's life had this man stored away? And why had he never reached out during all those years when her grandfather's influence could have been acknowledged? Rick Solomon's voice echoed in her memory from his latest television appearance. Clint Eastwood's success story is a self-made myth. The former child actor turned producer had been pushing this narrative for years, but Maria knew better. She had grown up with her grandfather's stories, not of the famous actor, but of the young man who had shown genuine interest in learning every aspect of filmmaking, who had respected the crew's craft. 57 years, Maria said, each word measured. That's how long it's been since you wore the poncho my grandfather made for you, the one that became your trademark. Eastwood's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Was it guilt? Remembrance? The man had built a career on being unreadable, but Maria had inherited her grandfather's gift for seeing beneath surfaces. She watched as his hand moved to his jacket pocket where something seemed to weigh heavily. Your grandfather never wanted recognition, Eastwood began, but Maria cut him off. No, he didn't. But he deserved it, and now he's sitting in that nursing home, his memories fading, while you've waited all these years to what? Make peace? Ease your conscience? The challenge hung in the air between them, as tangible as the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light. Behind them, her grandfather's workshop stood as a silent witness to conversations long past, to lessons taught and learned, to the beginning of a legacy that had taken an unexpected path. What would her grandfather say if he could see them now? Would he understand Maria's protective anger? Would he remind her, as he so often had, that true craft needs no spotlight? The questions tumbled through her mind as she waited for Eastwood's response, wondering if the man before her was truly the student her grandfather had once believed in, or if Rick Solomon's cynical assessment held more truth than she wanted to admit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the abandoned western set as Rick Solomon's luxury SUV kicked up dust along the access road. At 94, Clint Eastwood's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he watched his former co-star's arrival through narrowed eyes. Some wounds, even those 50 years old, never quite healed over. Maria Delgado stepped protectively closer to Clint, her earlier confrontation with him temporarily forgotten in the face of this new arrival. She'd heard enough stories from her grandfather Tomás about Rick Solomon to know the former child actor turned producer rarely appeared anywhere without dollar signs in his eyes. "Well, if it isn't the legend himself," Rick called out, his practiced smile not quite reaching his eyes. "And Miss Delgado, your grandfather mentioned you'd been keeping an eye on the old place." He moved with the artificial smoothness of someone who'd had too much cosmetic work done, a walking testament to Hollywood's fear of aging. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The tension between the two men crackled like static before a storm. Their shared history stretched back to the early days of Rawhide, when Rick had played a recurring role as a precocious orphan, a role that had led to a brief but lucrative career as a child star. Unlike Clint, who'd fought for increasingly challenging dramatic parts, Rick had leveraged his early fame into producing nostalgic entertainment properties. "What brings you out here, Rick?" Clint's voice carried the same quiet authority it had held for decades, though perhaps with a slightly more pronounced rasp. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Rick's smile widened as he pulled a folder from his leather briefcase. "Progress, old friend. The kind that could preserve this place forever." He gestured expansively at the weathered buildings around them. "I'm putting together a series of classic TV conventions. Big events, real crowd pleasers, and what better centerpiece than the original Rawhide set?" Maria's sharp intake of breath drew both men's attention. "This isn't just some movie set," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "My grandfather helped build these structures, by hand. They're part of our local history." "Exactly." Rick's enthusiasm felt calculated, rehearsed. "Think of the tourism potential. We could restore the buildings, add some modern amenities, make it a destination." He turned to Clint, his expression knowing. "The fans still love you, Clint. They'd pay good money to walk where you walked, see what you saw." The proposal hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Clint's gaze drifted to the carpenter's shed where he'd spent countless hours with Tomás Delgado, learning not just about set construction, but about craftsmanship, integrity, and the value of honest work. Those lessons had shaped his approach to both acting and directing, though he'd never told Tomás how profound his influence had been. Rick pressed on, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the growing tension. "We could do special events, signings, photo opportunities, the whole 9 yards. He pulled out architectural renderings showing gift shops and food courts seamlessly integrated into the historic structures. "We've got investors lined up, just waiting for the green light." Maria's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "And who exactly owns these rights you're so eager to sell?" The question caused Rick's smooth facade to crack slightly. "Well, that's why I'm here. The original studio contracts are a bit complicated, but with Clint's endorsement and your family's historical connection, we could cut through all that red tape." Clint remained silent, his expression unreadable as he studied his former colleague. How many times over the decades had Rick tried to capitalize on their shared past? Each attempt more elaborate than the last, each one missing the point entirely about what made this place special. The wind picked up, carrying with it the creaking of old wood and the whisper of memories. Somewhere in the distance, a door banged shut, making Maria jump slightly. But Clint didn't flinch. He was too busy, watching Rick's face, seeing past the practiced charm to the desperate ambition beneath. What would Tomás say about all this? The old carpenter had never sought recognition or profit from his work, finding satisfaction instead in the quality of his craftsmanship and the integrity of his methods. How would he feel about his beloved set being transformed into a tourist trap? The answer lay somewhere in the weathered boards and hand-driven nails, in the careful angles and precise joints that had survived decades of sun and storm. But before Clint could voice his thoughts, Rick pulled out one final document with a flourish that suggested he believed it would settle everything in his favor. What none of them realized was that the true battle for the soul of Rawhide Trail was just beginning, and the ghosts of the past would have their say before all was said and done. The weight of decades pressed heavily upon Clint Eastwood as he stood in the familiar shadows of Stage 12, where memories lingered like dust motes in the afternoon sun. What had Rick Solomon's arrival stirred within him? Perhaps it was the way the aging producer's eyes had gleamed with dollar signs when surveying the old set pieces, or how his casual dismissal of Tomás Delgado's craftsmanship had made Clint's blood boil. The scene transported him back to 1955, when a much younger Clint had struggled through take after take of a pivotal scene. The frustration had built until he'd stormed off, finding refuge among the wooden scaffolding where Tomás typically worked. The old carpenter hadn't offered empty platitudes or hollow encouragement. Instead, he'd simply continued working on a decorative post, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "Wood remembers," Tomás had said, running his fingers along the grain. "Every mark we make, every mistake we sand away, it becomes part of the story." He'd guided young Clint's hand across the surface, letting him feel the subtle imperfections beneath the smooth finish. Like acting, no? Each take leaves something behind, teaches something new. The memory stirred something in present-day Clint's chest as he watched Maria Delgado examining her grandfather's old workbench. How many times had he seen Tomás at that very spot, transforming raw lumber into movie magic? The history teacher's protective stance over her grandfather's legacy mirrored Tomás's own quiet dignity, a trait that had profoundly influenced Clint's approach to his craft. Rick Solomon's voice carried across the soundstage, discussing potential merchandise opportunities with his assistants. The contrast between his commercial ambitions and Tomás's humble dedication couldn't have been starker. Would today's audiences understand the value of craftsmanship that prioritized substance over spectacle? Another memory surfaced, young Clint watching Tomás repair a damaged set piece late into the night. "Why spend so much time on something that will only be seen for a few seconds on screen?" he'd asked. Tomás had smiled, continuing his meticulous work. "Because those few seconds must be true, mi amigo. The camera may lie, but the wood never does." Maria's voice cut through Clint's reverie. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" Her initial hostility had softened, replaced by a knowing look that reminded him so much of her grandfather. What would Tomás think of their current situation, of Rick's plans to turn his life's work into tourist attractions? The conversation between young Clint and Tomás had continued that night, touching on themes that would shape both their futures. In Hollywood, everyone wants to be seen, to be famous, Tomás had observed. But the real art happens in the shadows, in the quiet moments between action and cut. It happens in the preparation, the dedication to getting things right. Those words echoed across time as Clint observed Rick's team measuring the old sets for reproduction. How could they possibly replicate the soul that Tomás had poured into every piece? Each board, each joint, each carefully considered detail carried the mark of a man who understood that true craftsmanship transcended mere appearance. The relationship between mentor and mentee had evolved that night, as Tomás shared not just techniques but wisdom. "Some people build their careers like they're constructing a facade. All show, no substance," he'd said. "But you, Clint, you remind me of old-growth timber, strong at the core, growing slowly but surely." Now, decades later, Clint found himself guardian to not just his own legacy but Tomás's as well. The old carpenter had never sought recognition, content to let his work speak for itself. But as Rick Solomon's plans threatened to commercialize and diminish that legacy, wasn't it time for someone to speak on Tomás's behalf? Maria's presence beside him felt like a bridge between past and present. She'd inherited her grandfather's eye for detail, his commitment to preserving what mattered. Together they represented different aspects of Tomás's influence, the craftsmanship that had shaped Hollywood's golden age, and the dedication to protecting its authentic history. What would it take to honor both legacies while preventing Rick's superficial exploitation? The answer, Clint suspected, lay in those long-ago lessons learned at Tomás's workbench. Sometimes the strongest statement came not from shouting to be heard, but from quietly doing what was right. How fitting that the solution might emerge from the very wisdom Tomás had imparted all those years ago. Hidden stories unfolds through the delicate pages of time-worn journals, their edges softened by decades of careful handling. Maria Delgado's fingers traced the familiar handwriting of her grandfather, Tomás, each stroke telling stories that had remained untold for nearly half a century. Across from her, Clint Eastwood's weathered face reflects the weight of memories stirring beneath the surface. The journals reveal Tomás's private thoughts about his years working on various film sets, but what catches Clint's attention are the detailed entries about his early days in Hollywood. Through Tomás's eyes, a portrait emerges of a young actor, struggling to find his footing, yet possessing an unmistakable determination that set him apart from others. The entries speak of quiet moments between takes, of conversations shared over wooden beams and carpenter's tools, of lessons that went far beyond the craft of acting. Maria's voice trembles slightly as she translates passages from Spanish to English, her grandfather's native language flowing into words that bridge the past and present. "He wrote about you often," she tells Clint, her initial skepticism softening as she reads accounts of her grandfather's pride in his young protégé's progress. The journals reveal how Tomás saw something in young Clint that others had missed, not just talent, but a willingness to learn from everyone around him regardless of their role on set. Rick Solomon appears in several entries, though not in the way he might have hoped. Tomás's words paint a picture of a child actor who never quite understood the collaborative nature of filmmaking, who saw himself as the center of every production. These observations resonate with Clint's own memories of Rick, adding depth to their current antagonistic relationship. The most revealing entries discuss the wooden hearts Tomás carved for various film projects. Each one represented a different lesson, a different story, a different moment of growth. For young Clint, these carved tokens became tangible reminders of the wisdom Tomás shared. The journal describes how Tomás would work late into the night, his hands carefully shaping each piece while reflecting on the day's events and the progress of his young friend. Maria discovers entries she had never read before, ones that speak of her grandfather's decision to step back from the film industry. Just as Clint's star began to rise, Tomás writes of his satisfaction in knowing he had contributed to something greater than himself, even if few would ever know the extent of his influence. His words reveal a man content to remain in the background, finding joy in the success of others rather than seeking recognition for himself. The journals also contain technical drawings and notes about set construction, interwoven with philosophical musings about the nature of storytelling and craft. Tomás saw parallels between building solid set pieces and building character, between the precision required for carpentry and the discipline needed for acting. His observations reveal how these seemingly different worlds connected through the fundamental principles of dedication and attention to detail. As they delve deeper into the journals, both Clint and Maria find themselves reevaluating their understanding of Tomás and each other. The written words serve as a bridge, connecting 3 generations through shared experiences and revealed truths. But what other secrets might these pages hold? What unspoken stories still wait to be discovered in Tomás's careful handwriting? The afternoon light fades as they continue reading, each page turning, revealing another layer of a man who shaped both their lives in profound ways. The journals become more than just records of the past. They transform into a conversation across time, allowing Tomás's wisdom to reach through the years and touch those he left behind. Through his written words, new understandings begin to form and old wounds start to heal. But as Maria turns to a particularly worn page, her expression changes. What revelation waits in these next entries? What truth has remained hidden all these years, waiting for the right moment to emerge? The answer lies in the fading ink of Tomás's careful script, ready to reshape everything they thought they knew about the past. The desert air grew crisp as darkness settled over the makeshift camp, where Clint Eastwood sat beside his old mentor, Tomás Delgado. The flickering campfire cast dancing shadows across their weathered faces, two men whose combined years of experience in Hollywood spanned nearly a century. Maria had stepped away to give them privacy, though her protective nature meant she remained within earshot, organizing her grandfather's journals by moonlight. Tomás broke the comfortable silence first, his voice carrying the weight of years, spent crafting stories behind the scenes. You remember that night on the rawhide set, Mijito, when the whole crew thought we'd lost the day's footage? His eyes twinkled with mischief, a glimpse of the younger man who had once guided an uncertain actor through his early career. Clint's trademark squint softened as the memory surfaced. The night you taught me about more than just carpentry, he replied, his voice gravelly with age but warm with affection. That evening had changed everything, not because of the near disaster with the film, but because of what happened after. The conversation drifted to Rick Solomon, who had been there that night too, just a child actor with dreams bigger than his talent. He never understood what you were trying to teach us, Clint mused, watching the embers rise toward the star-studded sky. About the craft being more important than the spotlight. Tomás shifted in his chair, his arthritis more pronounced in the cooling air. Rick saw only what he wanted to see, but you listened. He paused, reaching for the thermos of coffee Maria had left them. Though I wonder sometimes if you listened too well, became too private with your stories. The question hung between them. Had Clint's fierce protection of his privacy, learned partly from Tomás's example, cost them both something precious? The sharing of their shared history, the acknowledgement of how one man's quiet guidance had helped shape not just a career, but a philosophy of filmmaking? Maria's voice carried softly from beyond the firelight as she read excerpts from her grandfather's journals, adding texture to their shared memories. Each entry revealed another layer of the relationship between the young actor and the wise carpenter, documented through Tomás's observant eyes. I never knew you kept such detailed accounts, Clint said, his curiosity piqued by the fragments of their past preserved in those pages. The journals contained not just technical notes about set construction, but observations about the craft of storytelling itself, lessons that had subtly shaped Clint's later work as a director. Tomás's response carried a hint of regret. Perhaps I should have shared them sooner, but like you, I learned to keep the important things close to the vest. He gestured toward where Maria sat. It took my granddaughter to show me the value of passing these stories on. The conversation turned to their current predicament, Rick Solomon's convention, the threatened exposure of private moments, the delicate balance between preserving history and protecting privacy. But here, under the vast desert sky, those concerns seemed smaller, more manageable. As the night deepened, their discussion wandered through decades of memories, each story illuminating another facet of their relationship. Tomás spoke of watching Clint's directorial style evolve, seeing echoes of their late-night discussions in the way he worked with crews and actors. Clint shared how Tomás's lessons about craftsmanship had influenced his approach to filmmaking, though he'd never publicly credited his mentor. The weight of unspoken gratitude and missed opportunities hung in the air between them. How many young filmmakers might have benefited from knowing the full story of their collaboration? What legacy had been hidden in the name of privacy? Maria occasionally joined their conversation, her historian's mind drawing connections between their personal history and the broader narrative of Hollywood's evolution. Her presence helped bridge the gaps in their shared story, her questions drawing out details that might otherwise have remained unspoken. As the fire burned low, Clint found himself wondering about the young man he'd been, so eager to learn, so uncertain of his path. Would that version of himself understand the choices he'd made? The stories he'd chosen to keep private? The price of fame and the value of silence? The desert night wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, protecting their conversation from the outside world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Rick's convention, the threat of exposed secrets, the need to decide what stories should finally be shared. But for now, two old friends sat beneath the stars, piecing together the mosaic of their shared past, while a younger generation listened and learned. What stories would Maria choose to preserve? How would she balance her grandfather's privacy with the historical significance of these memories? The answers lay somewhere in the darkness beyond the dying fire, waiting to be discovered with the dawn. The desert evening had given way to morning, but the previous night's conversations between Clint and Tomás lingered like whispers in the wind. Maria Delgado stood at her classroom window, absently touching the worn photograph of her grandfather as a young man on a movie set. How many stories had been lost to time, buried beneath the glamour and glitz of Hollywood's golden age? The relationship between her grandfather and Clint Eastwood had always been a point of confusion for Maria. Growing up, Tomás rarely spoke of his years working in film, preferring instead to focus on his family and local community work. Yet here was Clint Eastwood, a living legend, speaking of her grandfather with such reverence that it challenged everything Maria had assumed about their past connection. What drove a man of Eastwood's stature to seek out an aging carpenter after all these years? The question nagged at Maria as she recalled Rick Solomon's recent attempts to capitalize on her grandfather's Hollywood connections. Solomon's persistent phone calls and promises of recognition through his nostalgia conventions had always struck her as hollow, especially compared to the quiet dignity with which Clint had approached their family. The morning stillness was broken by a knock at her classroom door. Rick Solomon stood there, his carefully maintained appearance at odds with the authentic southwestern charm of the local high school. "Maria, we need to talk about your grandfather's memorabilia. The convention circuit is hungry for authentic pieces from the golden age." Maria's response was interrupted by the unexpected appearance of Clint in the hallway. The tension between the two men was immediate and palpable. Rick's facade of casual friendliness cracked slightly as he regarded his former colleague. "Well, if it isn't the man himself, still trying to rewrite history, Clint." The aging actor's response was measured, carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Some things aren't meant to be sold, Rick. Some stories deserve more respect than that." His words seemed to resonate with something deep within Maria's understanding of her grandfather's legacy. Through the awkward exchange, Maria began to see the subtle differences between the two men's approaches to the past. While Rick saw dollar signs and photo opportunities, Clint's presence spoke of something more profound, a desire to acknowledge the invisible hands that had shaped his career. The memory of her grandfather's words about craftsmanship and integrity surfaced in Maria's mind. How often had Tomás spoken about the importance of building things to last, whether they were physical structures or relationships? The parallel between his carpentry work and his impact on young Clint's career became clearer with each passing moment. Rick's persistent pursuit of memorabilia and stories for his conventions suddenly appeared shallow compared to the genuine connection she witnessed between Clint and her grandfather. What stories lay beneath the surface of their shared past? What lessons had been exchanged between the young actor and the seasoned craftsman? As Rick continued his sales pitch, Maria found herself studying Clint's weathered face, seeing beyond the iconic image to the man who had once been her grandfather's student in more ways than one. The previous night's conversation had revealed glimpses of a younger, uncertain Clint learning not just about set construction, but about life itself from Tomás Delgado. The dynamics in the room shifted as Maria stepped forward, finally understanding the true value of the legacy she was protecting. It wasn't about memorabilia or convention appearances. It was about preserving the authentic connections and lessons that had shaped not just her grandfather's life, but the lives of those he had touched. The morning light cast long shadows through the classroom windows, reminiscent of the way the past cast its influence over the present. How many other untold stories of mentorship and guidance lay hidden in the margins of Hollywood's history? What other invisible hands had shaped the careers of those who became legends? Maria's perspective on Clint's presence in their lives began to transform. Perhaps his return wasn't about nostalgia or guilt, but about acknowledging the profound impact of those quiet moments of guidance that had helped shape his journey. The bridge between past and present, between the visible and invisible contributors to Hollywood's legacy, was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered studio lot as Rick Solomon strode confidently through the aging wooden structures, his designer shoes clicking against the cracked concrete. Who would have thought that the former child actor would one day hold the power to reshape the very grounds where his career began? His fingers traced the peeling paint of Stage 4, where decades ago he had shared scenes with a young, uncertain Clint Eastwood. But today wasn't about nostalgia. Rick had arranged a meeting with potential developers, their sleek suits and digital presentations a stark contrast to the rustic charm of the old studio buildings. How many of these ancient sets had stories buried within their walls? Stories that would soon be replaced by modern architecture and profitable ventures. Maria Delgado watched from her grandfather's old workshop, her historian's heart aching as she observed Rick's entourage measuring and photographing the structures. What would Tomás think of this transformation? The careful craftsmanship he had poured into every beam and support would soon be reduced to rubble, replaced by steel and glass. The development plans spread across Rick's mahogany desk told a story of progress. Luxury condominiums, boutique shopping, and a small museum, dedicated to the golden age of television. But where was the soul in these pristine renderings? Where were the marks left by countless hands, the whispered conversations between takes, the moments of magic captured on film? Clint Eastwood's arrival at the studio that afternoon wasn't a coincidence. His weathered face carried the weight of years spent on these very grounds, each wrinkle a chapter in a story that began with Tomás's guidance. How different would his path have been without the wise carpenter's influence? The question lingered as he observed Rick's presentation from the shadows. Rick's voice carried across the lot, his practiced charm working its magic on the investors. Imagine transforming this outdated space into a modern entertainment complex. We'll preserve the history while creating something new, something profitable. But what history would truly remain once the bulldozers arrived? Maria found herself caught between worlds, her grandfather's legacy and the inevitable march of progress. She watched as Clint's expression hardened, recognizing the same determination she had often seen in old photographs of him with her grandfather. What secrets lay in those unspoken moments between mentor and mentee? The development plans represented more than just architectural changes. They threatened to erase the tangible connections to a past where craftsmanship meant more than efficiency, where relationships were built alongside sets, where young actors like Clint learned not just their lines but their values from men like Tomás. Rick's presentation continued, his words painting pictures of a future that seemed to grow more hollow with each projected revenue stream. How could he quantify the worth of memories, the value of lessons learned between takes, the importance of preserving spaces where magic wasn't just created, but crafted with care and dedication? As the investors nodded appreciatively at potential profit margins, Clint's presence served as a silent reminder of what stood to be lost. His career had been built not just on talent, but on the foundation of respect and craftsmanship that Tomás had instilled in him. Would future generations understand the importance of these lessons if their physical connections to the past were erased? Maria's research into the studio's history had revealed countless stories of collaboration, creativity, and community. Each beam her grandfather had placed, each set he had crafted, held within it the essence of an era when entertainment was created through human connection rather than digital efficiency. How could she preserve these stories when their physical anchors were threatened? The tension between progress and preservation hung heavy in the air as Rick concluded his presentation. The developers' enthusiasm was palpable, their visions already transforming the sacred space into profit centers. But in their eagerness to build the future, how much of the past would they unknowingly destroy? The question remained unspoken but present in every exchanged glance between Maria and Clint. What would it take to protect not just the physical structures, but the spirit of creativity and mentorship that had shaped countless careers within these walls. As Rick's voice faded into discussions of timelines and budgets, the true battle for the soul of the studio was just beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the old Western set as Clint Eastwood ran his weathered hand along a splintered beam. 94 years had etched deep lines in his face, much like the grooves time had carved into the wood beneath his fingers. How many stories lay hidden in these timbers, waiting to be preserved? Maria Delgado's voice cut through his reverie, her initial hostility now tempered by shared purpose. "My grandfather's markings are still visible here," she said, pointing to a series of carpenter's notations scratched into a support post. Each piece tells its own story. The history teacher in her couldn't help but document everything they found, her notebook filling with sketches and observations that bridged past and present. Tomás Delgado worked quietly nearby, his octogenarian hand still steady as he assessed the structural integrity of a false storefront. The old carpenter moved with deliberate precision, his expertise undimmed by age. He paused occasionally, lost in memories of the young actor who had once shadowed his every move, asking endless questions about joinery and load-bearing walls. Rick Solomon's threat to demolish the set had galvanized them into action. But where did one begin to preserve decades of history? The task before them seemed as vast as the Western landscapes these buildings had helped bring to life. Each rotting board and rusty nail presented a choice. What could be saved, what must be replaced, and what stories would be lost in the process? The preservation work sparked unexpected conversations between the three generations present. As they cataloged damage and began basic repairs, Maria discovered parallels between her grandfather's craftsmanship and the authenticity Clint had sought in his films. "You learned more than just carpentry from my grandfather, didn't you?" she asked, watching Clint demonstrate a traditional wood joining technique to a group of volunteer preservationists. Their work attracted attention from the local community. Word spread about the effort to save the historic set, drawing former film crew members and their families. Each visitor brought new stories, filling in pieces of a complex historical puzzle. A retired grip recalled how Tomás had engineered an innovative pulley system for a particularly challenging shot. The daughter of a long-ago props master shared photographs of her father working alongside both Tomás and a young Clint. The physical labor of preservation provided a counterpoint to these emerging narratives. While stories flowed freely, the actual work demanded focus and precision. Clint found himself returning to lessons learned decades ago under Tomás's guidance. The proper angle for a crosscut saw, the importance of measuring twice, the patience required to let wood acclimate before working it. Maria's documentation grew more detailed as she recognized patterns in her grandfather's work. "He built redundancy into everything," she noted, examining a seemingly simple wall brace. "These structures were meant to last far beyond their expected use." Her observation carried weight beyond the physical construction, touching on the legacy Tomás had built through his mentorship of others. The preservation effort faced constant challenges. Modern building codes required careful negotiation. Environmental concerns needed addressing. And always Rick Solomon's development plans loomed on the horizon, a reminder that time worked against them. Yet each small victory, a restored doorframe, a reinforced foundation, a saved piece of film history, strengthened their resolve. As sunset approached each day, the team would gather to assess their progress. These moments often found Clint lost in thought, seeing double images, the set as it had been in his youth, overlaid with its current state of elegant decay. How much of the past could they really preserve? What would future generations make of their efforts to save these carefully crafted illusions? The work continued, measured in small victories and careful repairs. Local craftspeople offered their services, recognizing the importance of preserving not just the physical structures but the techniques used to create them. Young apprentice carpenters worked alongside veterans, learning traditional methods that predated power tools and quick-fix solutions. Through it all, Tomás remained the quiet center of their efforts, his decades of experience guiding their work even as age limited his physical participation. His presence reminded everyone that they were preserving more than just buildings. They were maintaining a connection to a way of working, of teaching, of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. But could they complete their task before Rick's bulldozers arrived to reduce these memories to splinters? The weight of decades settled around Clint Eastwood as he held an old carpenter's level in his weathered hands, its brass edges dulled by time but still functional. How many times had Tomás Delgado used this simple tool to teach him lessons that went far beyond mere carpentry? The memory surfaced unbidden, as clear as the day it happened in 1954. Young Clint had been struggling with a particularly challenging scene, his frustration mounting with each take. Between shots, he'd retreated to Tomás's workshop, seeking the quiet sanctuary among the sawdust and tools. The elderly carpenter hadn't acknowledged him directly, continuing to work on a decorative arch for an upcoming Western. Instead of offering immediate advice, Tomás had simply handed him the level and pointed to a beam that needed positioning. The lesson revealed itself through action rather than words. As young Clint struggled to align the beam perfectly, Tomás worked alongside him in companionable silence. The subtle adjustments, the patience required, the understanding that true balance wasn't achieved in a single movement. These parallels to acting hadn't been lost on the aspiring performer. When had Tomás's wisdom begun to shape his approach to not just acting, but life itself? Maria's voice drew present-day Clint back to reality. She stood in the doorway of her grandfather's old workshop, her expression softening as she watched him with the level. The antagonism that had marked their early interactions had gradually given way to understanding, though questions still lingered in her eyes. What did she see when she looked at him? The young man her grandfather had mentored, or the Hollywood icon who'd left that world behind? The workshop itself seemed to hold countless untold stories. Each tool, each worn workbench, each carefully preserved piece of equipment spoke to Tomás's dedication to his craft. Rick Solomon had never understood this aspect of their shared past, too focused on the glamour and glory of Hollywood to appreciate the foundational lessons learned in this humble space. His recent attempts to commercialize their history through nostalgia conventions felt like a betrayal of these quieter, more meaningful moments. Young Clint had spent countless hours here, absorbing Tomás's silent teachings. The old carpenter never directly instructed him on acting technique or career choices. Instead, he demonstrated the value of precision, patience, and pride in one's work through his actions. When had those lessons begun to take root? How had they influenced the choices that set him apart from peers like Rick, who chased fame at any cost? Maria approached the workbench, running her fingers along its scarred surface. As a history teacher, she understood the importance of preservation, of keeping these tangible connections to the past alive. But there was more than just historical value here. There was a living legacy that connected 3 generations through shared experiences and unspoken understanding. The level in Clint's hands represented more than just a tool. It symbolized the balance Tomás had taught him to seek in all aspects of life, between ambition and humility, between public persona and private self, between the past and present. The old carpenter's influence extended far beyond the practical skills he'd imparted, shaping the very foundation of Clint's approach to his craft and his life. The workshop held another lesson, one that revealed itself gradually over the years. Tomás had never sought recognition or acclaim for his contributions to countless films, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than the accolades it might bring. This quiet dignity had left an indelible mark on young Clint, influencing his own career choices and his eventual step back from the spotlight. As Maria began sharing stories of her grandfather's later years, Clint realized how the mentor-mentee relationship had evolved into something more complex and meaningful. Tomás's influence hadn't ended when Clint's career took off. It had simply taken new forms, manifesting in decisions made and paths chosen throughout his life. What other lessons still waited to be discovered in this workshop, in these memories, in the silent spaces between words? The level's bubble still found true, decades after its last use. Some tools, like some lessons, remained reliable long after their teacher had passed on. As Clint and Maria continued their work of preservation, the workshop seemed to come alive with memories of those silent teachings, each tool and surface holding fragments of wisdom waiting to be rediscovered and understood anew. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mission San Luis Rey's courtyard as Maria Delgado watched her high school students carefully catalog weathered pieces of the original rawhide set. Who could have predicted that a simple local history lesson would evolve into something far more meaningful? The teenagers worked with unexpected reverence, perhaps sensing they were touching pieces of both Hollywood and their own community's past. The relationship between the entertainment industry and San Luis Rey had always been complex, but Maria's students approached their task with fresh eyes unburdened by old grievances. They meticulously photographed each piece, creating detailed digital records while their teacher reflected on how quickly things had changed since Clint Eastwood's unexpected return to their small community. 17-year-old Sophie Martinez, president of the school's history club, approached Maria with a leather-bound ledger she'd discovered among the set pieces. The book's pages contained Tomás Delgado's precise measurements and notes, written in his characteristic mix of Spanish and English. Maria traced her grandfather's handwriting with her fingertips, remembering how those same hands had taught her to measure twice and cut once, a lesson that extended far beyond carpentry. Across the courtyard, Rick Solomon observed the students' efforts with poorly concealed disdain. The former child actor turned convention producer had been hovering around the preservation project like a vulture, waiting for an opportunity to capitalize on any nostalgia he could package and sell. His presence served as a reminder of how the entertainment industry often reduced history to marketable moments, stripped of their true significance. The students' genuine enthusiasm stood in stark contrast to Solomon's calculating gaze. They asked questions about Tomás's techniques, eager to understand how he had transformed simple lumber into convincing Old West structures. Their curiosity would have delighted her grandfather, who had always believed that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. Maria's phone buzzed with a message from Clint Eastwood's assistant, requesting permission to visit the preservation site. The 94-year-old actor's interest in the project had evolved from obligation to genuine investment, though Maria still struggled to reconcile the man before her with the young actor her grandfather had once mentored. How much of Tomás's influence had shaped Eastwood's legendary career? The students' work revealed unexpected connections between the past and present. They discovered that many of Tomás's construction techniques had incorporated traditional Mexican building methods, adding authentic details that most viewers had never consciously noticed, but had contributed to the show's realistic atmosphere. These subtle touches reflected the often overlooked influence of craftsmen like her grandfather on American popular culture. Local contractors, hearing about the preservation effort, began offering their services. Third-generation carpenters recognized Tomás's work from stories their own grandparents had shared. The project was evolving into something larger than Maria had anticipated, a celebration of craftsmanship that transcended the boundaries between entertainment and community heritage. Young voices filled the courtyard with questions about technique and history, creating an impromptu classroom where the past actively informed the present. Maria found herself sharing not just historical facts, but the personal stories Tomás had told her about the golden age of television production. Each memory shared seemed to strengthen the connection between her students and their community's role in shaping popular culture. The preservation project had begun to attract attention beyond San Luis Rey. Film historians and set designers contacted Maria, intrigued by the discovery of original construction documents and Tomás's innovative solutions to period-specific challenges. Would this renewed interest finally bring recognition to the countless craftsmen whose contributions had long been overshadowed by on-screen talent? As the sun climbed higher, Maria watched her students work with growing pride. They were doing more than preserving old wood and faded blueprints. They were reconstructing a narrative that challenged the simplified version of Hollywood history. Through their efforts, Tomás Delgado's legacy was finding new life, not as a footnote in entertainment history, but as a bridge between generations of creators and craftsmen. Solomon's presence served as a reminder of what could have been lost. The authentic connections and genuine craftsmanship that had characterized her grandfather's era. Yet the student's dedication suggested a different future, one where the value of true artistry might be recognized and preserved. Their work posed an essential question. In an age of digital effects and virtual sets, what other stories of behind-the-scenes artistry waited to be discovered and celebrated? The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered western set as Rick Solomon's luxury SUV kicked up dust along the access road. Through his tinted windows, real estate developers in pressed suits peered at the aging facades, already calculating profit margins and square footage where history stood. Who would have thought that a simple nostalgia convention could evolve into such a lucrative opportunity? For Rick, this moment represented vindication. Decades of living in Clint Eastwood's shadow had taught him to recognize opportunities others missed. While his former co-star had chased artistic integrity and critical acclaim, Rick had mastered the business of Hollywood memorabilia and fan experiences. But why stop at conventions when prime California real estate beckoned? Maria Delgado noticed the vehicles from her classroom window, her students still buzzing with excitement from yesterday's volunteer restoration work. The sight of surveying equipment being unloaded sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. What would her grandfather think, seeing developers sizing up the set he'd built with his own hands? Across town, Clint sat in his study, examining old photographs from his early career. One particular image caught his eye. A young Rick Solomon hamming it up for the camera, while Tomás Delgado worked quietly in the background, measuring lumber for the next day's shoot. The contrast between Rick's showmanship and Tomás's craftsmanship spoke volumes about the paths they'd chosen. Rick led his entourage through the set, his voice carrying across the empty street. Imagine luxury condos with authentic Western themes. We'll preserve some facade elements as decoration. Very Instagram-worthy. The developers nodded appreciatively, jotting notes on tablets while their surveyor took measurements. Had anyone noticed the fresh paint and repairs from Maria's students, or did they see only dollar signs? Maria's phone buzzed with concerned messages from community members who'd spotted the developers. The local historical society had already raised the alarm, but what legal standing did they have? The land's ownership was a complex web of studio rights and property laws. Would passion for preservation be enough against corporate interests? Clint found himself drawn to the window, lost in thought about Tomás's lessons on craftsmanship and integrity. Rick had always been more interested in the spotlight than the craft, even as a child actor. Now he was back, treating their shared history as nothing more than a marketing angle. How many others had forgotten the real stories behind these wooden facades? The developer's presence stirred up more than dust. Long-buried tensions between old Hollywood and the local community rose to the surface. Rick's plans represented more than just real estate development. They threatened to erase the tangible connections to a pivotal era in film history. But who would stand against progress when profits seemed guaranteed? Maria watched her students' faces fall as they realized the implications of the surveying team's presence. These young people had just discovered their connection to Hollywood history through their restoration work. How could she explain that their efforts might have been in vain? The question hung in the air like the dust from Rick's departing vehicles. 32. Day's events forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about preservation versus progress. Rick's vision of luxury housing threatened more than just buildings. It endangered the stories and lessons embedded in every nail and board. As the sun set behind the western facades, shadows lengthened across weathered wood that had witnessed decades of both real and fictional drama. Would tomorrow bring more surveyors, or would someone find a way to protect this physical link to cinema's golden age? Clint's memories of Tomás's wisdom seemed more relevant than ever. The old carpenter had always said that true value couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. But in a world where prime real estate trumped historical significance, could those lessons still resonate? The answer might lie in bringing together unlikely allies against an all-too-familiar threat to Hollywood's tangible heritage. The documentary unfolds as a delicate dance between memory and preservation, with Clint Eastwood finding himself in an unfamiliar role, that of a student once again. The veteran actor, now in his 90s, sits across from Tomás Delgado, their shared history spanning decades of Hollywood's golden age. The camera rolls capturing not just words but the weight of years between them. Tomás's weathered hands move through the air as he speaks, each gesture punctuating stories that had never made it to any official Hollywood record. His granddaughter Maria operates the camera, her initial skepticism having evolved into a quiet determination to document every detail. Who would have thought that the man who once dominated the silver screen would now sit in reverent silence, listening to tales of the craftsman who built the very stages he performed on? The stories flow naturally, revealing the invisible architecture of classic films. Tomás recalls the precise angle of support beams that held up entire Western towns, the hidden trapdoors that made movie magic possible, and the countless innovations born from necessity and ingenuity. Through his narratives, a different Hollywood emerges, one built by calloused hands and practical wisdom rather than glamour and spotlight. Rick Solomon's presence looms over the proceedings, though he isn't physically there. His development plans for the historic studio lots serve as an urgent backdrop to their documentation efforts. Each story Tomás shares feels like a piece of evidence being preserved just before it might be lost forever. What happens to history when its physical foundations are demolished for luxury condominiums? Maria interjects occasionally with questions that bridge generations, her historian's training bringing structure to Tomás's flowing memories. She notices how Clint leans forward when Tomás mentions specific film sets, his own memories clearly stirring. How many of these moments had the actor taken for granted in his youth? What details had he missed while focusing on his lines and hitting his marks? The documentation process reveals unexpected layers of their shared past. Tomás describes innovations he developed that became industry standards, techniques for building collapsible structures, methods for creating authentic-looking aged wood, solutions for camera angles that no one had considered before. Clint finds himself learning about the very sets he had worked on, seeing them through new eyes decades later. Young Rick Solomon appears in some of these stories, a child actor who once showed promise before becoming entangled in Hollywood's darker aspects. The contrast between his past innocence and current ruthless business practices adds complexity to their current conflict. What transforms a wide-eyed child actor into someone willing to erase history for profit? As the afternoon progresses, the documentary evolves beyond simple historical record. It becomes a meditation on mentorship, on the invisible hands that shape greatness, on the wisdom that exists in the margins of fame. Tomás's stories reveal how many of Clint's iconic moments on screen were made possible by the technical brilliance of crew members whose names never appeared in credits. Maria watches her grandfather closely, noting how sharing these memories seems to energize him. She sees something else too, the way Clint's legendary stoicism softens when Tomás recalls specific moments of teaching and guidance. How many other untold stories of Hollywood's true builders might be lost to time and progress? The recording session takes an unexpected turn when Tomás begins sharing stories about innovations that failed, the experiments and mistakes that led to better solutions. These human moments, full of problem-solving and persistence, paint a picture of Hollywood, craftsmanship that no textbook has captured. Through these narratives, the true foundation of the film industry emerges, not in the stars but in the problem-solvers who made movie magic possible. The light changes as day turns to evening, but no one moves to stop the recording. There's an unspoken understanding that these moments are precious, that each story captured is a small victory against time and forgetting. The camera continues rolling, preserving not just words but the essence of an era when movies were built by hand, when solutions came from experience rather than computer graphics, when mentorship meant more than just career advancement. What emerges through the lens is more than just a documentary. It's a testament to the invisible architects of dreams, to the wisdom that exists in practical knowledge, to the relationships that build more than just movie sets. As Tomás continues sharing his stories, the question hangs in the air. Can this record of the past help protect its physical remnants from those who see only profit in progress? The battle for preserving Tomás Delgado's craftsmanship emerged not with a bang but with a registered letter that arrived on Maria's desk one Tuesday morning. The developer's intentions were clear: demolish the historic Western sets to make way for a luxury resort complex. For Clint Eastwood, the timing couldn't have been more poignant. He had just finished recording hours of Tomás's memories about building those very structures. Maria's hands trembled as she dialed Clint's number. Their relationship, once marked by suspicion, had evolved into an unlikely alliance. "They want to tear it all down," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. Clint's response was immediate and resolute. "Not while I'm breathing." The legal proceedings unveiled a complex web of ownership rights and historical preservation claims. Rick Solomon, ever the opportunist, emerged as a silent partner in the development project. His appearance at the preliminary hearing brought a familiar smirk that made Clint's jaw tighten. The former child actor had transformed into everything Clint had actively chosen to avoid: a man who valued profit over legacy. Tomás, now confined to his wheelchair but sharp as ever, provided crucial testimony about the set's historical significance. His detailed accounts of construction techniques from the 1950s captivated the preservation board. Each nail, each wooden beam, told a story of American cinema's golden age. The documentary footage Clint had recently recorded proved invaluable, showing Tomás's intimate knowledge of every structure's history. Behind the scenes, Maria leveraged her connections in the historical society, while Clint mobilized support from the film industry. The contrast between their approaches reflected their generations. Maria's methodical research and documentation complemented Clint's direct calls to studio executives and industry veterans who understood the cultural significance of these locations. Rick Solomon's involvement complicated matters. He orchestrated a media campaign painting the preservation efforts as wealthy Hollywood elites, preventing economic development in a struggling community. The irony wasn't lost on Clint, who remembered a young Rick once declaring his love for these very sets during their early acting days. The legal proceedings forced Clint to confront his own relationship with the past. During one particularly heated deposition, he found himself describing the day Tomás had taught him about proper wood grain alignment, a lesson that extended far beyond carpentry. "It's not about building something that looks good for the camera," he recalled Tomás saying. "It's about building something that stands true." Maria discovered archived permits and contracts that revealed her grandfather's original agreements with the studios. These documents proved crucial in establishing the historical easements that could protect the sets. Each evening, as she pored over yellowed papers, she understood more deeply why her grandfather had always insisted on keeping every document, every receipt. The development company's lawyers argued for progress, presenting sleek renderings of proposed facilities that promised economic revival. But their arguments failed to account for the intangible value of heritage, something Tomás had spent his life protecting without fanfare or recognition. As the legal battle intensified, unexpected allies emerged. Former crew members and actors who had worked on the sets came forward with stories and testimonials. Each account reinforced what Clint had known since his early days. These weren't just movie sets. They were repositories of shared cultural memory. The turning point came when Rick Solomon's own past statements about the set's historical importance surfaced. Interviews from his child actor days where he proudly described working in real piece of American history. His current position as a developer suddenly appeared nakedly opportunistic, undermining his credibility with the preservation board. Through it all, Tomás remained a quiet center of gravity. His presence at the hearings, though silent, reminded everyone of the human element in this fight. These weren't just structures of wood and nail. They were the physical manifestation of one man's dedication to his craft, and through that, to the art of storytelling itself. The legal battle evolved into something larger than property rights or development permits. It became a referendum on what communities choose to value and preserve. For Clint, each court appearance reinforced why he had first chosen to document Tomás's story, not just to preserve the past, but to protect the future's ability to learn from it. How would future generations understand the craft of filmmaking without these tangible connections to cinema's past? What stories would be lost if these structures, built by careful hands and preserved through decades of desert winds, were replaced by contemporary conveniences? The morning sun cast long shadows across Tomás Delgado's weathered workshop, where decades of film history lingered in sawdust-covered corners. At 94, Clint Eastwood's hands traced the familiar grain of a wooden beam, his weathered fingers finding the same marks they had 7 decades ago. The preservation battle for the old Western set had awakened memories he'd long tucked away, like forgotten props in an abandoned studio. Maria Delgado watched from the doorway, her historian's eye catching details others might miss. The way Clint's posture shifted when handling her grandfather's tools, how his typical stern expression softened when discussing the craftsmanship of the false fronts and hitching posts. These weren't just movie props to him. They were touchstones to a time when a young actor learned more than just his lines. The community meeting at the local high school gymnasium had drawn an unexpected crowd. Rick Solomon, ever the showman, had attempted to frame the development project as progress, but his words fell flat against the authentic voices of 3 generations of locals. Their stories painted a different picture, one of countless westerns, filmed against these backdrop, of summer jobs building and maintaining sets, of tourism that sustained small businesses through lean times. "Your grandfather never wanted credit," Clint remarked to Maria, his voice carrying the weight of years. He'd say the work spoke for itself. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Tomás's humble craftsmanship had outlasted many of the films shot on his sets. Maria's initial skepticism of Clint had gradually eroded as she recognized the genuine respect he held for her grandfather's legacy. Rick Solomon's latest legal maneuver had backfired spectacularly. His attempt to dismiss the historical significance of the set had prompted an outpouring of documentation, photographs, employment records, and personal accounts that traced the site's influence on both the film industry and the local economy. The community's response transformed what could have been a simple real estate transaction into a movement to preserve their cultural heritage. Young families shared stories passed down from grandparents who'd worked alongside Tomás. Local business owners testified about the steady stream of film buffs and Western enthusiasts who still made pilgrimages to the location. Even former crew members from various productions had begun sending letters of support, each one adding another layer to the site's historical significance. The preservation effort had taken on a life of its own, extending beyond the initial legal challenges. Local artists created works inspired by the set's history, teachers incorporated its story into their curricula, and amateur historians began documenting the countless productions that had used the location. What started as a fight against development had evolved into a celebration of community identity. For Clint, each new revelation about the set's impact brought him back to those early days when Tomás had taken a young, uncertain actor under his wing. The master carpenter had taught him more than just appreciation for craftsmanship. He'd demonstrated how attention to detail and respect for one's work could influence others in unexpected ways. These lessons had shaped Clint's own directing style decades later, though he'd never explicitly acknowledged their source until now. Maria found herself increasingly drawn into the role of mediator between the old Hollywood represented by Clint and the new generation of preservation advocates. Her academic background provided the framework to articulate the site's historical value, while her personal connection through Tomás gave emotional weight to the argument. The movement she helped coordinate wasn't just about saving buildings. It was about preserving a tangible link to a transformative period in both local and film history. Rick Solomon's position became increasingly untenable as public support for preservation grew. His attempts to paint the development as economic progress were undermined by impact studies showing the potential for heritage tourism. The same networking skills he'd used to build his convention empire now worked against him as social media amplified the preservation campaign beyond local borders. The question of what would become of the set once saved remained open, but ideas flourished. Some proposed a working museum where film students could learn traditional set construction techniques. Others suggested using it as a backdrop for historical reenactments or educational programs about the golden age of Hollywood. The community's enthusiasm generated possibilities that transcended mere preservation. Through it all, Clint found himself reconnecting with aspects of his past he'd long relegated to memory. The young man who'd once learned at Tomás's workbench would have never imagined standing here decades later, fighting to protect not just buildings, but the legacy of craftsmanship and community they represented. As plans for the site's future took shape, he realized that sometimes the most important roles aren't played before the camera, but in the quiet moments when people come together to protect what matters most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the old Western set as Rick Solomon paced nervously through the weathered buildings. His perfectly pressed suit stood in stark contrast to the authentic grit of the surroundings, a physical manifestation of everything that separated him from the true spirit of these hallowed grounds. Who would have thought that a former child actor's desperate grasp at relevance would lead to this moment? Rick's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his investors, each one more threatening than the last. The demolition crews waited at the perimeter, their machines idle but ready. How had that old man Clint managed to rally the entire town against what should have been a simple real estate deal? The thought of his former co-star turned industry legend still made Rick's jaw clench, decades of resentment bubbling to the surface. Maria Delgado stood at her grandfather Tomás's kitchen window, watching Rick's agitated movements across the lot. The past weeks had taught her much about the complex web of relationships that bound these men together. Her grandfather's quiet dignity had shaped not just the physical structures around them, but the very character of those who worked here, none more so than Clint Eastwood himself. Across town, Clint sat in his modest hotel room, studying an old photograph of himself with Tomás Delgado. At 94, his hands weren't as steady as they once were, but his mind remained sharp as he traced the connections between past and present. What would Tomás think of the battle being waged over his life's work? The old carpenter had never sought recognition, yet his influence had rippled through decades of filmmaking. Rick's desperate plan began to unfold as private security teams moved into position around the set's perimeter. He had secured an emergency demolition order through questionable means, betting everything on speed and surprise. But had he underestimated the bonds forged in this place so many years ago? The sound of approaching vehicles drew Maria's attention. Through the morning haze, she spotted familiar faces from town gathering at the main entrance. Teachers, shopkeepers, families who had lived here for generations. They formed a human chain, their presence a silent rebuke to Rick's schemes. Among them, she recognized faces from the Historical Society, clutching documents that could change everything. Clint's arrival caused a stir among the gathered crowd. He moved slowly but purposefully, his presence commanding respect even now. The years seemed to fall away as he surveyed the set where his journey had begun. How many lessons had Tomás taught him here, not just about carpentry and craftsmanship, but about integrity and perseverance? Rick watched the scene unfold from his vantage point, his confidence wavering. The sight of his old co-star brought back memories he'd rather forget. Moments when Clint had chosen authenticity over artifice, while Rick had pursued fame at any cost. What would it take to make him understand that some things held value beyond their market price? Maria found herself caught between worlds as she approached the gathering crowd. Her grandfather's teachings about preservation and respect echoed in her mind, alongside newer understanding about the power of community and shared history. How had she never fully grasped the significance of what he had built here? The tension mounted as Rick's security team faced off against the townspeople. Documents were produced, phones rang with calls from lawyers and city officials, and the morning air crackled with possibility. Would Rick's desperate gambit succeed? Or would the spirit of what Tomás Delgado had created prove stronger than any legal maneuver? Clint moved through the crowd toward his former colleague, each step weighted with history. The young men they had once been seemed to walk beside them, one who had learned the value of craft and community, the other who had chosen a different path. Could there be redemption in this moment, or had too much time passed for understanding? The morning wore on. The true battle wasn't just for buildings and land, but for the soul of a place that had shaped so many lives. The legacy of Tomás Delgado lived on through every person who stood their ground, through his granddaughter's determination, and through the lessons he had taught a young actor who became a legend. What would the next hours reveal about the power of community and the true meaning of heritage? The acrid smell of smoke filled the air as Rick Solomon stood before the old studio lot, his trembling hands clutching a silver lighter. Who would have thought that 60 years of Hollywood history could become so vulnerable to a single flame? Behind him, the demolition equipment sat idle, a testament to his failed attempt to legally destroy what he viewed as nothing more than prime real estate. But for Clint Eastwood, watching from the shadows of Stage 12, this wasn't just about property. It was about preserving the soul of an era that had shaped him. His weathered face reflected the orange glow of Rick's threatening gesture, each flicker of the flame illuminating memories of a young actor who once walked these very grounds under Tomás Delgado's guidance. Maria Delgado's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You really think burning it down will erase what happened here, Rick?" She emerged from behind one of the ancient light rigs, her grandfather's old tool belt wrapped around her waist, a symbol of defiance against everything Rick represented. The history teacher in her understood that some legacies couldn't be reduced to ashes, no matter how hot the fire burned. Rick's laugh carried a hollow bitterness that echoed across the empty lot. What happened here? Nothing happened here except broken promises and forgotten names. His eyes locked onto Clint, decades of resentment spilling out. "You gotta be the star, Eastwood. The rest of us, we became footnotes in your story." The weight of 94 years pressed heavily on Clint's shoulders as he stepped forward. How many times had he walked this path between stages 12 and 13, listening to Tomás's wisdom about craftsmanship and dignity? Those lessons had carried him through decades of filmmaking, long after others had forgotten the humble carpenter who helped build Hollywood's dreams. "You're wrong about nothing happening here, Rick." Clint's voice carried the gravelly authority that had commanded countless scenes. "Everything happened here. Every nail Tomás drove into these walls, every set piece he crafted. They built more than just movies. They built character." Maria's hand instinctively touched her grandfather's tool belt, feeling the worn leather that had witnessed the golden age of Hollywood. She remembered the stories he'd told her about the young Clint Eastwood, so different from the legend who now stood before them. Those tales had initially fueled her skepticism toward the actor, but watching him now defending her grandfather's legacy, she recognized the truth in those old narratives. Rick's grip on the lighter tightened. "Character? Is that what you call it when you climb to the top and forget everyone who helped you get there?" His free hand gestured wildly at the surrounding buildings. "These stages were supposed to be our launching pad, all of us. Instead, they became a monument to just one man's success." The accusation hung in the air, challenging not just Clint's legacy but the very foundations of his journey from an uncertain young actor to an American icon. How could he make Rick understand that success wasn't measured in billboard space or award statues, but in the lessons learned from men like Tomás Delgado? A gentle breeze carried the scent of old wood and distant memories across the lot, stirring up dust that had settled over decades of storytelling. Each moat contained fragments of dreams, some realized, others abandoned, all part of the complex tapestry that had woven their lives together in this place. Clint took another step forward, his movement deliberate and measured. "You think I forgot, Rick? Every role I directed, every scene I shot, Tomás's voice was there, teaching me about the importance of building things right, about respecting the craft." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But you were too busy chasing spotlights to hear those lessons." The lighter trembled more violently in Rick's hand as the truth of Clint's words pierced his carefully constructed narrative of victimhood. What had he really been fighting against all these years? Was it the success of others or his own inability to recognize the true value of what these stages represented? Maria moved closer to the confrontation, her presence a bridge between past and present. What would her grandfather say if he could see them now? 3 lives shaped by his influence standing at the crossroads of preservation and destruction. How had his quiet wisdom created such profound ripples through time? The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wood of the old western set as Maria Delgado stood before the gathered crowd, her grandfather's carpenter's pencil tucked behind her ear. The historical landmark designation ceremony brought together an unlikely assembly of preservationists, film enthusiasts, and industry veterans, but none commanded more attention than Clint Eastwood, whose towering presence served as a living bridge between Hollywood's past and present. At 94, Clint's weathered face bore the marks of countless days under the California sun, each line telling a story of films that had shaped American cinema. As Maria spoke about the site's significance, his mind wandered to those early days when Tomás Delgado's steady hands had guided his own through the intricacies of set construction. How many young actors today understood the value of learning from the craftspeople behind the scenes? Rick Solomon shifted uncomfortably in his front row seat, his designer suit out of place among the authentic Western surroundings. His presence at the ceremony was more obligation than choice, given his position as a prominent industry figure. Yet his eyes kept darting toward Clint, carrying the weight of their shared past and divergent paths. The designation wasn't just about preserving wooden structures and false fronts. It represented a recognition of the countless unnamed artisans who had built Hollywood from the ground up. Maria's voice carried her grandfather's passion as she detailed the historical significance of each building, each nail, each carefully crafted detail that had transformed mere lumber into movie magic. Clint found himself drawn to the old saloon entrance, where Tomás had first taught him about the importance of authenticity in set construction. "A false front tells a true story," the old carpenter had said, his wisdom extending far beyond mere craftsmanship. Those words echoed through decades of filmmaking, influencing every project Clint had directed. The ceremony proceeded with the unveiling of the official landmark plaque, its bronze surface catching the light. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she pulled away the covering, revealing an inscription that began with Tomás Delgado's name. It was a victory that had taken years of persistence, countless documents, and the support of industry veterans who understood the value of preserving not just the physical structures but the stories they contained. Rick Solomon's attempted intervention in the designation process had ultimately backfired, his plans for a themed entertainment venue thwarted by the community's overwhelming support for preservation. As he watched the proceedings, his expression shifted between resignation and calculation, perhaps finally understanding that some legacies couldn't be commercialized. The gathered crowd included several of Tomás's former colleagues, their aged faces bearing witness to decades of Hollywood craftsmanship. Each had their own stories of the humble carpenter who had never sought the spotlight, but had influenced countless productions through his dedication to authentic detail and proper technique. Maria's voice carried across the gathering as she shared personal memories of her grandfather working on this very set, his tools speaking their own language of creation and care. The historical designation represented more than just protection for these aging structures. It acknowledged the contributions of craftspeople who had built the foundation of American cinema with their own hands. Clint stepped forward when invited to speak, his presence commanding immediate attention. The words he shared weren't about his own achievements or the famous films shot on these grounds. Instead, he spoke of Tomás Delgado's patience in teaching a young actor about respect for craft, about the importance of understanding every aspect of filmmaking from the ground up. The morning ceremony concluded with the official transfer of preservation responsibilities to a local historical society, ensuring that future generations would have access to this tangible piece of cinema history. As the crowd began to disperse, Clint noticed Maria standing alone by her grandfather's old workbench, now protected behind museum-grade glass. What stories would these preserved sets tell to future filmmakers? How many young artists might find inspiration in the careful craftsmanship of a previous generation? The historical designation marked not an ending, but a continuation, a promise that the legacy of Hollywood's craftspeople would endure, their contributions acknowledged and honored by those who understood the true foundations of movie-making magic. The final tribute unfolds as a testament to the intricate web of relationships that shaped Hollywood's golden era, centering on Clint Eastwood's determination to honor the man who helped forge his legendary career. The weight of 94 years rests in every deliberate step as Clint surveys the newly designated historical landmark, his weathered hands trailing along the preserved woodwork that still bears Tomás Delgado's distinctive craftsmanship. Maria Delgado watches from the entrance, her initial skepticism having mellowed into understanding as she observes the iconic actor's reverence for her grandfather's work. The transformation in their relationship mirrors the changing facade of the old set pieces, where time has only enhanced their significance rather than diminished it. Rick Solomon's unexpected arrival creates a ripple of tension through the gathering crowd. His presence serves as a reminder of the path not taken, the glittering world of conventions and memorabilia that Clint had consciously rejected throughout his career. The former child actor turned producer carries himself with the practiced smile of someone who has made a career of selling nostalgia. But today's event represents something far more authentic than his usual fare. The celebration takes shape around them, with Clint insisting on maintaining the focus on Tomás rather than himself. Local craftsmen, some of whom learned their trade from the master carpenter, arrive bearing tools that mirror those used decades ago. Their presence bridges the gap between past and present, just as Maria's careful historical documentation has preserved the stories that might otherwise have been lost to time. Through the afternoon, Clint finds himself drifting between conversations and memories. Each interaction triggers flashbacks to his younger self, eager and uncertain, absorbing the quiet wisdom Tomás shared between hammer strikes and saw cuts. The contrast between those early days and the present moment highlights the circular nature of their journey, how a young actor's respect for a humble craftsman would eventually lead to this day of recognition. The celebration grows beyond the initial plans, drawing in members of the film community who had worked with Tomás over the years. Their stories weave together, creating a tapestry of memories that reveals the far-reaching influence of the quiet carpenter who preferred to let his work speak for itself. Each tale adds another layer to the legacy being honored, demonstrating how one person's dedication to craft can ripple through generations. Maria finds herself overwhelmed by the scope of her grandfather's impact as she listens to account after account of his influence. The history teacher in her recognizes the importance of this oral tradition, these first-hand accounts that bring the past to vivid life. She begins recording these impromptu testimonials, understanding that they form an essential part of both Hollywood's history and her family's heritage. Rick Solomon's attempts to network and promote his latest ventures fall flat among this gathering focused on genuine appreciation rather than commercial gain. The contrast between his approach and the authentic atmosphere of the celebration serves to highlight the very values Tomás had instilled in young Clint: the importance of substance over flash, of craftsmanship over quick profit. As the day progresses, Clint takes center stage not as the Hollywood icon he became, but as the grateful student paying tribute to a mentor. His speech avoids the typical polish of industry events, instead carrying the raw honesty of someone sharing deeply personal truths. He speaks of lessons learned not just about construction and set design, but about integrity, dedication, and the quiet dignity of doing one's best work, regardless of recognition. The celebration culminates in the unveiling of a permanent installation, chronicling Tomás's contributions to the film industry. The display, carefully curated by Maria with input from Clint, presents not just the technical achievements but the human story behind them. It stands as a testament to the often overlooked craftsman who built the foundation of Hollywood's dream factory, one careful measurement and precise cut at a time. What emerges through this gathering is more than just a tribute to one man. It becomes a reflection on the nature of legacy itself. How do the choices we make echo through time? What truly matters in the end, the accolades we receive or the lives we touch? These questions resonate through the conversations and remembrances, creating a moment of genuine connection among all those present. The weight of memories hung heavy in the late afternoon air as Clint Eastwood stood before the newly dedicated memorial plaque at the old studio lot. His weathered hands traced the engraved name of Tomás Delgado, the man who had shaped not just sets but souls during Hollywood's golden age. How many young actors had passed through these gates, their dreams as bright as the California sun, never knowing the quiet craftsmen who helped build the foundations of their careers? Maria Delgado watched from a respectful distance, her earlier misgivings about Clint's intentions having melted away like morning fog. The past few weeks had revealed a side of the iconic actor that few had witnessed. Not the steely-eyed gunslinger, but a man carrying decades of gratitude for her grandfather's guidance. Her fingers clutched a worn leather-bound notebook filled with Tomás's sketches of set designs, each page a testament to his uncredited genius. Rick Solomon's attempted interference at the dedication ceremony had backfired spectacularly. His manufactured nostalgia empire seemed hollow compared to the genuine article standing before them. When he'd tried to turn the event into another celebrity photo opportunity, Clint had simply fixed him with that familiar squint. And Rick had, wilted like a B-movie villain facing high noon. The poncho lay folded with careful precision on the memorial bench. Not a replica, not a costume department copy, but the original. The one Tomás had modified for a young, uncertain actor 4 decades ago. The garment carried more than just the dust of countless Western sets. It held the fingerprints of craftsmanship and care that had transformed a prop into an icon. Time had a way of bringing truth into sharp focus. Clint remembered the day Tomás had first shown him how to wear it, not just as a costume piece but as armor against self-doubt. A man's worth isn't in what he wears, Tomás had said, but in how he carries himself. Those words had followed Clint through every role, every direction, every triumph and setback in his career. Young actors still wandered these lots, their dreams as fresh as spring grass. Would they understand the legacy laid out before them? The quiet dedication of craftsmen like Tomás who built Hollywood from the ground up, one careful measurement at a time. The question lingered in the air like sawdust in a carpenter's workshop. Maria stepped forward, her historian's instinct recognizing the significance of the moment. She had spent years preserving local heritage. But this was different. This was living history, breathing its last passionate sighs into the future. The poncho would be displayed in a custom-built case, protected from time's ravages while remaining visible to inspire future generations. Memories flickered like old film reels in Clint's mind. Tomás adjusting a young actor's stance, teaching him to find his center of gravity. Rick Solomon, then just another child actor, watching from the sidelines, choosing a different path. The countless hours spent learning not just about acting, but about dignity, craftsmanship, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing one's true worth. The studio lot had changed over the decades. Modern buildings pressed against vintage facades like eager understudies, but some spaces remained untouched by time. In the old carpenter's workshop, now preserved as part of the studio's heritage, Tomás's tools still hung in perfect order, each hammer, saw, and plane waiting for hands that would never return. What would Tomás think of all this attention? The man who had declined screen credits, who had waved away praise with calloused hands, who had found satisfaction in the simple act of creation? Perhaps he would recognize that his true legacy lived not in plaques or preserved costumes, but in the lessons he had imparted, the lives he had touched, the stories he had helped tell. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lot, Clint prepared to take his leave. The poncho's absence felt right, a piece of his past returning home to honor the man who had helped shape his future. Maria's presence ensured that Tomás's story would continue, not as a footnote in Hollywood history, but as a reminder that true artistry often works in silence, building foundations strong enough to support dreams. The old guard was fading like celluloid exposed too long to light, but their stories, their craftsmanship, their dedication to something greater than fame, these things remained, waiting to be discovered by new generations who might learn that the most important scenes in life often unfold behind the camera, in the quiet moments between action and cut. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.